All right, so today we're diving into something that I feel like a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people underestimate until they actually try to do it, which is organizing a Web3 side event during a major conference week. And if you've ever been to something like Token
Yeah.
2049 or EthCC, you already know it's chaos. Hundreds of events, overlapping schedules, people double booked across the city. It's intense.
Yeah. And I think what's funny is that from the outside, it looks easy. Like people think you just book a venue, throw up a registration link, maybe get some sponsors, and that's it. But once you're actually inside that ecosystem, you realize it's incredibly competitive. You're not just organizing an event, you're competing for attention in one of the most saturated environments imaginable.
Exactly. And I've seen this firsthand. I remember being in Singapore during Token 2049, and I had a
Yeah, I
list of
get
like
that.
10 events I wanted to go to in one evening, and they were all happening at the same time. So immediately, you realize that just being good isn't enough. You need to stand out.
Right. And that's actually where most organizers go wrong. They think logistics is the hard
Huh.
part, like finding a venue or sorting catering. But the real challenge starts way before that. It starts with the concept. And this is something both Mary and Kimberly talk about very clearly.
Yeah, let's start there because that idea really stood out to me. The concept comes first. Not the venue, not the speakers, not even the budget. The concept.
Exactly. And Kimberly frames it in a way that I've actually started using myself when thinking about events. She talks about this one sentence test. If you can't explain your event in a single sharp sentence, then nobody else is going to understand it either, especially not media or attendees.
Totally. That's such a brutal but accurate filter.
It really is. And she breaks it down into 3 questions. Why does this exist? Why now? And why these people? And if you think about it, that's actually how people decide whether to attend anything during a conference week. They're not reading long descriptions. They're scanning quickly and making decisions in seconds.
I've definitely done that. You're just scrolling through event lists and something either clicks
Yeah.
instantly or it doesn't.
Exactly. And Kimberly makes this really sharp distinction between what high traction events feel like versus ignored ones. A high traction event feels like the only room where a specific group of founders and investors are meeting off record. It feels exclusive, intentional, almost like something you don't want to miss because it's not happening anywhere else.
And the opposite?
The opposite is just another happy hour. And I've been to those. You walk in, it's crowded, but not in a meaningful way. People are kind of floating around, no real structure, no clear reason for being there. It's forgettable.
Yeah, it's like noise. And I think that ties into something Mary pointed out as well. The execution gap when the concept is vague.
Exactly. Mary basically says you can't just create a Luma link and expect magic to happen. And I've seen so many teams do exactly that. They set up an event page, maybe post it on Twitter once, and then they're surprised when attendance is low or the room feels off.
Right.
She emphasizes that promotion needs to be structured. Event aggregators, community posts, social campaigns, cross-posting with co-hosts, getting into curated lists. But here's the key thing. All of that only works if the concept is strong. If the idea itself isn't compelling, no amount of distribution is going to fix it.
That's such an important point. Because people often think promotion is the lever, but it's really amplification, not transformation.
Exactly. And Mary also highlights something very practical. People follow names, brands, recognizable speakers, known ecosystems. In a crowded week, recognition acts as a filter. It helps people decide quickly whether something is worth their time.
That's so true. I've definitely chosen events just because I recognized 1 or 2 names attached to it.
Same. And I think that's one of those things that feels a bit superficial at first, but it's actually just how decision-making works under time pressure. When you have 10 options, you go with what feels familiar or high signal.
So if we move from concept into timing, because that's another big piece, How early do you actually need to start planning something like this?
It really depends on the type of event. And this is where Mary and Kimberley give slightly different
Go on.
perspectives that actually complement each other. Mary says that for a smaller, focused event, especially if it's invite only and you're not chasing sponsors or external speakers, you can get away with starting 2 to 3 weeks in advance.
That feels tight.
It is, but it's doable if everything is controlled. The key is that even in that short window, you still need to execute the full promotion checklist. Aggregators, communities, social posts, none of that gets skipped just because the timeline is shorter.
And I'm guessing that changes pretty quickly if the event is bigger.
Yeah, dramatically. For anything involving sponsors, panels, or big-name speakers, Mary recommends starting 5 to 6 months in advance. And that makes sense when you think about it. Those people's calendars fill up early, and sponsors want time to evaluate where they're putting their budget.
Right.
6 to 8 weeks out? That's the sweet spot, she says. Lock your concept, confirm your partners, and get yourself on the radar of journalists. That's a pretty specific window.
Because media works on its own timeline.
Exactly. Editors plan conference coverage early.
Totally.
So if your event isn't visible to them before they assign stories, you're basically out of that cycle. At that point, you can still get amplification, tweets, mentions, maybe some newsletter coverage, but you've lost the ability to shape the narrative.
That distinction between narrative shaping and amplification is really, really interesting.
Yeah, and it changes how you think about timing. Early on, you're influencing how your event fits into the broader conversation around the conference. Later on, you're just trying to get people through the door.
And there's also that signal she mentions, that the best events are already circulating socially 2 to 3 weeks before they happen.
Exactly. And that's organic circulation. It's people sharing it because they want to be there, not because they were targeted by ads. That's usually a sign that the concept and the guest list are strong enough to generate momentum on their own.
Right.
And that actually brings us to what I think is one of the most important ideas in all of this. The room is the product.
Yeah, this one hit hard.
Because most people focus on the visible aspects of an event. The venue, the lighting, the food. And those things matter, but they're not what determines whether the event is successful. Kimberley is very direct about this. The best events are invitation-driven, intentionally oversubscribed, and curated.
So it's not about how many people you get. It's about who those people are.
Exactly. And also how they're matched. She talks about pre-matching, investor with founder, operator with founder. It's about designing interactions, not just creating a space.
That's such a different mindset.
It is. And she contrasts that with what she calls the worst case scenario. Open RSVP links blasted everywhere, hundreds of signups, low turnout, and no meaningful connections because nobody knows anyone.
I've been to that exact event.
We all have. And she makes this really important point. Scarcity is a signal. If an event feels too open, it can actually push away the people you most want to attract, because they interpret that openness as a lack of curation.
That's counterintuitive for a lot of people.
It is, especially if you're thinking in terms of maximizing attendance. But high signal attendees care more about who else is in the room than, how big the room is.
And Mary ties this back to production, right?
Yeah. She points out that in Web3, production quality is basically the baseline now. The community is used to high-end events, so any visible mistakes, bad audio, disorganized check-in, sloppy setup, can damage your reputation.
So you can't ignore production, but it's not what makes you stand out.
Exactly. It's table stakes. A great room with poor execution hurts credibility. A perfect setup with the wrong people is just empty value. You need both, but the sequencing matters. Get the room right first, then make sure the execution supports it.
That makes sense. Now, shifting into media, because this is another area where I think people really misunderstand what actually works. A lot of organizers ask, how do I get press coverage for my event?
Yeah, and Kimberley flips that question completely. She says journalists don't cover events. They cover what happens at events. And that's a huge mindset shift.
So it's not about the event itself, it's about the story inside it.
Exactly. If there's nothing publishable happening, there's nothing for media to work with. And she frames it very simply. If a journalist can't answer why their editor would approve the story, then it's not media worthy.
That's such a clear filter.
It is. And what actually works are things like announcements, funding rounds revealed in the room, partnerships announced live, product launches, regulatory insights. Something that creates news beyond the event itself.
So the event becomes a container for something bigger.
Exactly. And Mary adds to this by emphasizing exclusivity from the journalist's perspective. If you want media attention, you need to give them something they can't get elsewhere. Unique insights, interviews, commentary from well-known speakers. I mean, that sounds obvious, but it's easier said than done.
Right.
Because that's what they're looking for. Content. Not vibes, not networking, but something they can actually turn into a story.
That's such a good way to put it. Now, let's talk about budget, because this is where people tend to get overwhelmed. Where should the money actually go?
This is one of the most practical parts of the whole discussion. And both Mary and Kimberley are very aligned on this, even though they approach it slightly differently. Kimberley says, most organizers spend too much on venue, food, and swag, and not enough on the social infrastructure around the event.
What does she mean by social infrastructure?
Things like who is co-hosting, who is amplifying the event, who needs to be seen there. It's about visibility and distribution through people, not just platforms.
That's interesting.
And she's very clear about where a limited budget should go. The guest list. That's non-negotiable. If the room is wrong, nothing else will save the event. Not PR, not influencers, not production upgrades.
That's pretty definitive.
It is. And she breaks it down into very practical things. VIP outreach, intentional invites, relationship-driven follow-ups, and managing room density. It's active work, not passive.
And Mary's perspective?
Mary emphasizes production quality as the baseline, but then keeps everything else lean. She mentions things like media partnerships, where you offer brand placement in exchange for coverage instead of actually paying for distribution.
That's smart.
Yeah, and she also points out that paid distribution isn't always necessary if you're doing social properly. Posting in communities, running campaigns, getting into event lists. It's about being strategic rather than just spending more.
So if we zoom out, it sounds like the budget should prioritize two things: the room and the perception of the room.
Exactly. Who's there and who people think is there. That combination drives everything else.
Now, one part that I think people often overlook is what happens after the event. Because there's this tendency to treat the event itself as the finish line.
Yeah, and that's actually where a lot of the long-term value is created or lost. The recap, the follow-up, the content that comes out afterward, that's what extends the life of the event.
Right.
Because think about it. Most people won't be in the room, but they will see the recap posts, the clips, the summaries. In many cases, more people experience the event after it happens than during it.
That's such a shift in perspective.
It is. And then there's the relationship side. The connections made during the event have a very, very short window where they're still warm. If you don't follow up within a few days, that context fades quickly.
I've definitely felt that. You meet someone, have a great conversation, and then if you don't follow up, it just disappears.
Exactly. And the most meaningful relationships I've seen come out of these events always involve quick follow-through. Messages sent while the interaction is still fresh.
So in a way, the event is just the starting point.
Yes, it's a catalyst. The real value comes from what happens after.
All right, so let's bring this all together. If someone is listening to this and thinking about organizing a Web3 side event, what are the key takeaways?
I'd say first, start with a sharp concept. If you can't explain your event in one sentence, it's not ready. Second, understand your timeline based on the scale of what you're building. Don't try to compress something that needs months into a few weeks. That never ends well.
Right.
Third, treat the room as the product. Curate intentionally, prioritize quality over quantity, and design interactions. Fourth, if you want media, create something newsworthy inside the event, not just around it.
And budget?
Focus your budget on the guest list and the social layer around it. Keep production solid, but don't overspend on things that don't drive outcomes. And finally, don't stop when the event ends. Follow up, publish recaps, extend the life cycle.
That's a great summary, and I think what stands out to me across everything we discussed, especially through Mary and Kimberly's insights, is that the best events are incredibly intentional. Nothing is random.
Exactly. Every decision, from concept to guest list to timing, builds on the previous one. And when it all aligns, that's when you get those events that people actually remember.
And talk about weeks later.
Yes, which is ultimately the goal.
All right, I think that's a perfect place to wrap. If you're thinking about organizing something during the next big conference week, hopefully this gives you a clearer picture of what actually matters and what doesn't.
Yeah, and maybe saves you from learning some of these lessons the hard way.
Exactly. Thanks for the conversation.
Anytime.